most of us have intimate experiences with shame. This is not about the shame that prevented Jonathan Franzen from writing his novel because he felt like writing autobiographical sentences made him want to take a shower. It's more about the shame implied with social exposure. And sometimes it's done by governments. This is a case in China where the Chinese government is carting around prostitutes, and you can actually see very well the shame display, covering the face, trying to make the body small. But it's not just about this kind of shame, which I think we can all agree makes us feel a bit uncomfortable. It's about this kind of shame, where Greenpeace flies a blimp over the Coke Industries headquarters to expose their funding of anti-climate legislation. This kind of shame, where Rainforest Action Network has gone after 9 banks that are funding mountaintop removal in Appalachia. And then I want to turn really quickly to another painful emotion, just to get it out of the room, which is guilt. I have my own personal reasons for feeling guilty, and psychologists say that guilt is a lot better than shame. In fact, they argue that guilt leads to reparation more easily than shame, and it takes on an action sort of about yourself rather than your whole self, so you can often make apologies. But there are arguments that actually guilt is a rather new emotion on the emotional stage. Shakespeare used the word guilt only 33 times in his plays, and he used the word shame 344 times. Also, in certain Eastern cultures, there's no word for guilt. There's only words that mean shame or translate to shame. So this is really interesting that though it's supposedly a more healthy emotion, it doesn't seem to be a universal one. Although studies on Westerners, especially one in the Netherlands, found that people on average feel guilty for about 2 hours a day. So we all know, like, hey, it's real for me. But the question is sort of how to delineate it properly from shame. And I can remember really well my first feeling of guilt, which has continued in this vein, and this is just a more recent headline, about what humans were doing to the planet. I read headlines like this and I'm pretty sure I would nail it down as guilt. But the very first time was for me in reading this book that I had when I was 8 years old. And I wrote to some organizations in the back of the book. And one of the organizations, the Earth Island Institute, sent me in response a photograph that left me totally floored. It was the first time that I felt guilty for the way humans were treating other animals. And it was on the basis of a campaign that sent this man, Sam Labuddy, undercover on board tuna fishing vessels off of Mexico. And he managed to capture what we knew had gone on for years, but what we didn't have visual evidence for, which was the slaughter of dolphins in tuna fishing gears. So when I was 9 years old, I get this letter, I open it up, and I see these black and white photographs, and I demanded that immediately that we boycott tuna. We could never eat tuna again, I told my mom. She agreed, and there was an actual widespread boycott. And then in 1990, just actually like not even a year later, this little label was introduced, the Dolphin Safe label, and my mom explained to me, look, there's this new thing, it's safe now, we can eat it. I use this to illustrate an example of what I think was a major pivotal point in history, which is that the focus of changing suppliers shifted to the focus of changing demand. And that individuals were made to feel like they were part of the problem, which was certainly true, but also that they could be part of the solution if they changed what they bought. And this is also intuitively very true, right? So the shift from changing the way the fishermen fished the tuna to changing the way that we consumed it, and then that would automatically have an effect on the way they caught the tuna if demand demanded it. And so Dolphin Safe logo was one of the first, along with organic logos, but now there have been a slew of these types of campaigns. The Forest Stewardship Council, cruelty-free, carbon neutral. In analyzing this, I really think that it wasn't necessarily strategic, but as a result of this kind of work, it re-engaged a minority that might have been really sort of active as citizens and as people demanding legislation that would sort of cover an entire industry, to re-engaging that minority as consumers. as people that could make a difference primarily through what they choose to buy. And the problem with any of these types of labels is that none of these represent more than 10% of the marketplace, with the exception of dolphin-safe tuna, which actually is very widespread and has actually had a difference, not just because of the label, but there was actually lots of legislation that came with it. So my argument is that the people who really care about these issues, and I'm not sure it will ever be more than 50% of the population, but that they were encouraged to not worry about so much the broader impacts, but to worry about their own consumption habits. And they were made to feel this way and encouraged to alleviate their feeling of guilt by engaging as consumers. Guilt has come to eclipse shame. Whereas in previous social movements, I mean, if you said during the attempt to abolish slavery that, yeah, it's fine, you don't have to own a slave. If you don't want to, don't own a slave. But if everyone else wants to, they can, and we'll let the market decide. This was not an appropriate blanket response to slavery. A more relevant issue in the case of, I think, products and in this case, labor abuses, was Cesar Chavez's widespread boycott of table grapes in California to try to get higher wages for migrant workers. And I think if you said to Cesar Chavez, what we're going to do is introduce a label that say these grapes were picked by workers who made a fair wage, and we're going to allow the market to decide, and the people who want to buy these grapes will, and those workers on those farms will be paid a fair wage, and the people who don't want to buy that will continue buying the same old grapes. And Cesar Chavez would not have found this acceptable. He wanted to raise the standard everywhere. And yet we have allowed, through these types of labels, to agree that the majority of industry can keep on behaving as they would like, and the part of industry that changes and caters to these consumers will wind up being sort of less than 10%. So I would argue throughout the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, guilt came to eclipse shame as a tool, because previously a lot of the focus was on using crowds to shame industries to get them to change and incite legislation. And there's a point here where I think I should distinguish really quickly between what is shame and what is shaming. Shame is obviously an emotion, the one that we're familiar with. It's a universal emotion. It probably evolved as a signal to submission to dominance hierarchy. Even Darwin was so interested in shame and marveled at why even the blind blush, because how do you have this response without having people who are blind from birth, as it turned out. Shame can also increase stress. So one thing that I have become really skeptical of is, when do we think people feel ashamed? So researchers, psychologists will tell you we can only know that by measuring cortisol response, because every other indicator can easily be faked. You can say you feel ashamed, but you don't. You can show a shame posture, but you don't. If you're in psychology, the whole question of feeling shame, you have to sort of say on what grounds you think that someone feels it. And Darwin also describes shame as thinking what others think of us. So again, this comes back to this idea of requiring an audience, linking somehow to reputation. And these are state shaming campaigns. So of course, early in history, the stocks, the pillory. But this is, in the US, more recent ones where you're asked to hold a sign for stealing outside of Walmart, or a judge in my home state of Ohio making this woman carry this sign because she drove around a school bus on the sidewalk. What's interesting also is, even though she kind of has the shame display by hiding her eyes, and her identity. But the key thing is that this is just one little slice of shaming. There's plenty of shaming that happens on the internet that's not at all linked to the state, right? Where the crowd actually comes in and is trying to issue public opprobrium. And how you feel about all these cases of shaming matters. So I don't necessarily endorse any of these cases, but how we actually feel matters, because shaming, that's kind of part of it, is that it requires an audience. And so if you as an audience don't feel comfortable with it or disagree with it, that makes shaming less powerful. And in fact, legal scholars have argued against shaming punishments on the grounds of protecting the audience more so than the victim. That we say we want a democratic justice system. We want due process. We want to alleviate ourselves of the impulse to punish. and we would therefore like the state to play that role rather than the crowd. And that's why also you see a lot of coverage online about the dangers of mob justice and public shaming on Twitter and in newspapers. And again, that's in part because not all shaming then is like all other shaming. I think we should avoid painting all shaming with this really broad brush to say all shaming is bad. And I hope to show you some cases that might challenge sort of that instinctive impulse. So in online shaming, there's no doubt that it really tends to go after, in the sort of Twitter sphere, and it attacks individuals. The punishment is disproportionate. And in fact, I would argue that that's most of our discomfort, is that the punishment often far outweighs the crime. The crime being often a politically incorrect statement on Twitter, right? Like not even nothing in real sort of physical space. There's no due process online, and it's carried out, again, by the crowds rather than the court. So all of this makes it feel a little bit like the town square, but kind of worse than the town square because it doesn't go away the next week. It's still searchable, it's still shareable, and it still will be even a year from now. But again, I would argue that the online sort of Twitter argument is a common and a problematic, but also a sort of narrow view of shame. Because maybe something like this makes you feel less uncomfortable. If certain towns in Britain are singled out as having the worst water pollution, if certain companies are singled out for behaving the worst in terms of palm oil plantations and rainforest destruction. And so again, I just want to emphasize that I think all shaming cannot be painted with the same broad brush. And here's some evidence of some of shaming's recent success. So a film came out in the States called Blackfish, which a documentary film about the sort of welfare issues around keeping orca whales at SeaWorld. And there was then a big grassroots campaign that followed. This, again, is not led by the government. It's entirely led by the crowds. A lot of it is actually just happening online. And here is the Washington Post tracking the stock value of SeaWorld since the film came out. Its stock value has plummeted 60%, its revenues are down 7%, attendance is down 5%. Southwest Airlines, which even painted its planes, like orca whales, ended its 25-year partnership as a result of social disapproval. Nothing to do, again, with legislation. Yet, now there are some major court cases being filed. Or you could argue that this was a shaming map put out by several different human rights organizations, highlighting in 2004 the countries that remained around the world that still executed juvenile offenders. And apparently this map was very influential in the Supreme Court's decision in 2005 to overturn the legislation that allowed the execution of juvenile offenders. So the Supreme Court outlawed it in 2005. And again, also the types of countries, Yemen, Iraq, Nigeria, who were alongside the US. And I think it's no surprise that President Obama is going to pursue a name and shame approach in the Paris Accord in November, talking about climate change, because on the one hand, at the international level, there are not a lot of options for other forms of formal punishment. Reputation at that international scale is one of our main drivers of changing behavior. And also because he knows that he probably won't get a formal agreement passed through Congress. So this is something he can do based on presidential authority, using the power of reputation rather than formal sanctions. It may not be ideal, but the question is, what else do we have? And then there's lots of interesting and cool research on shame, and a lot of this tends toward individuals rather than corporations or institutions. But I just want to share some of it with you now. Research showing that actually shaming and dirty looks have mattered to reduce smoking as much as taxes on cigarettes. Really interesting experiments threatening to expose in certain towns in the US the names of people who do vote in the election, and then in another group of people, the names of people who do not vote. And in this experiment, both actually shame and honor mobilized voting, but only shame mobilized people who were not as likely to vote. So again, it depends on sort of what the problem is and who you're most interested in, and whether or not you feel like it's acceptable to go after individuals at all. And then an experiment my colleagues and I did also on shame and honor, looking at how social exposure, the threat of social exposure, affects cooperation. And so in a cooperative game setting where students could give or not give money to a public pool, that was doubled and redistributed to others. Both shame and honor, the threat of it, and then we actually followed through after 10 rounds of the game, led to increased cooperation by about 50%. So you're going to say, well, you just said honor worked in voting, and you said honor worked in your experiment, so why are we giving a talk about shame? We could all feel better if you would talk about honor. But here's a case by the state of California where they single out the top 500 tax delinquents in the state. You have to owe more than $100,000. They've been doing this since 2007. They've gotten over $400 million in back taxes as a result of this campaign. And you ask yourself, how could they use honor in the same way? To honor the 92% of people who do pay their state taxes, it's just not really an option. And also, I should say that this program only costs about $100,000 a year to run, and they do actually target individuals, and actually individuals within the tax system at the state level have a greater impact than corporations. Also, really, really important, the threat of shame is more important and more effective than the shame itself. So the key period is the 6 months before their name is listed online. That's when they might pay their taxes. Once they're already on the list, it's much harder. And this is what we found in our experiments too, is once you have a bad reputation, it's very hard to convince anyone to improve it. So the idea is to not allow it to be eroded to begin with. And why not use honor with climate change? Again, the countries who are not producing emissions, like if we want to honor Fiji, I just think it's not going to make as big of a difference to the climate debate as going after China, the US, and India. This is a collective action problem. So often the worst players in the game matter more to us than the most cooperative players. So that is just to say that, again, the nature of the problem matters as to whether or not you turn to social disapproval. And I would argue problems that are more social in nature are more amenable to social disapproval. So this is an example of an app that you can use to alert your friends and your social network if you press the snooze button too many times. So I would argue this is a misuse of shaming and social disapproval, because I don't care if you oversleep. It has nothing to do with me. But it's trying to tap into what they know is the power of being watched. So a problem like vaccinations, which in the US has been a real issue lately, it's no surprise that during this, the whole measles outbreak, there was lots of talk about turning to shame and social disapproval, because this problem is much more social in nature, I would argue, than the snooze button.
You mentioned in the talk that shaming has to be specifically applied. Is it possible to shame someone who doesn't feel a sense of social disapproval?
You can argue almost that SeaWorld, does it feel anything? It's unlikely SeaWorld feels anything at all. It's an institution. And yet it responds to social disapproval. And so I think that there are institutions and individuals who are shameless, and often that's because they're insulated in really interesting ways. You know, for instance, private companies actually wind up being more insulated than public companies, or banks that don't have a retail arm. Barclays actually gets targeted because it has this consumer familiarity, whereas, you know, a bank that doesn't have a consumer or retailer arm is more immune from the social pressure. So it's interesting that sort of brands, they get both the positive and the negative side. And certainly with individuals, that can be true too. If you're a super wealthy individual, you might care less about sort of public opprobrium. And if you're super poor, there's a legal scholar who says, you know, being poor insulates you because you can't fall further sort of on the economic rung, and being wealthy insulates you because
You've probably got more money.
you're not really worried about
really
having a job. Yeah.
Yeah.